In het kader van Les in Toveren nu een gesprek met een Sufi over Soefisme. Atum Kane en hij komt uit Canada. Op Kleurnet Soefisme. Goeiedag. God, de liefde, het universum, het leven. Zijn dat andere dingen, zijn dat dezelfde dingen? Het zijn in ieder geval vragen die ons bezighouden. En er zijn mensen in deze wereld die zich daar meer mee bezighouden. Sommige mensen noemen dat mystici of gelovigen. Maar het is wel een onderwerp waar je heel diep mee bezig kunt houden. Als je werkelijk iets met God hebt, iets met de liefde hebt, dan is dat niet alleen iets voor zondagmorgen, dan is dat iets voor je hele leven. Een groep mensen in de wereld die dat op een heel bijzondere manier uitdraagt zijn de Soefies. En misschien heeft u dat woord wel eens gehoord in de context van de islam. Het is een mystieke tak van de islam, zeggen sommige mensen. Maar het is eigenlijk ook een op zichzelf staande beweging. Het Soefisme. Het is een beweging die al heel oud is en die hele diepe gronden heeft. En die ons niet alleen een denkwezen heeft nagelaten, maar ook heel veel mooie gedichten. Dichters als Rumi hebben prachtige gedichten geschreven. Met name over die relatie tussen ons en de hemel. Tussen ons en God, tussen de beloved en wij zelf. We gaan vandaag praten met Atum Kane. Hij is een leraar, een rondreizende, ja, ik zou misschien het woord prediker moeten gebruiken, maar hij geeft workshops, hij geeft teachings en hij is bovenal ook verhalenverteller. En daar gaan we mee beginnen. Welcome, Atum.
Thank you.
And I was telling about what I think a little bit about Sufism, but I would like to start with how I saw you first was as a storyteller.
Yes. Certainly.
Now, what is the relationship between storytelling and Sufism?
Well, I think first of all of the great teachers in all of the great traditions primarily taught through story, because it's a way of rooting teaching in human experience. And Sufism certainly has been a tradition that's been filled with stories. And what I find is often when people come to a program, they'll write the teachings down in a notebook, but what they remember, what they carry with them is the stories. So if I see people a couple of years later, they'll often ask me about the story, or they've lived with the story. And as a Jewish teacher, Reb Shlomo Carlebach said some time ago that really the value of a story, whether it's something you find in the Bible or whether you find in another great book of a various tradition, is the discovery that it's your story. And so that's when it really speaks to people, when it's their story.
Mm-hmm.
And
it feels that stories reach a deeper level in ourselves. We have these teachings with interesting words and concepts, and we write them down and schematics. But a story, it is as if it reaches your childlike nature.
Well, one of the reasons I like to tell stories is when I look at people's faces as I tell the stories, you really see what we call the soul. I mean, there's a way in which people lose their self-consciousness when they listen to the story, the way a child does. And there's a kind of wholeness that takes place, an integration of the body's present, and the heart is present, and the mind is present, but in a very open, integrated way. And I think story goes right in. Where often what we do, especially in a Western culture, is we collect a lot of information. I mean, my experience is so many people have a tremendous knowledge of psychology or spirituality, but the actual opportunity to integrate it is an entirely different situation. And what we hear in a story is we hear the human condition. And that's where we can recognize ourselves in the archetypal human situations.
Yeah, our fairy stories, they refer to archetypal ideas, and there's always the good man, and there is the somewhat stupid-looking guy who, in the end, makes the remark that hits the nail on the head, so to speak. I recognize in Sufi stories these deeper patterns, and they are universal patterns. And there's black and white, and then in the black you find a little white dot that turns out that. When you tell stories, do you see the patterns, or do you see the images of what you're telling?
When I'm telling the story, what I try to do is to simply be open and be present. I know the story, but each time I tell it, it comes out in a different way. The essential pieces are there, but often it weaves in a different way, or another piece may be accented, or another part of it will emerge told in a different way. And I think that often has to do with what's happening for the people in the audience.
So you're interactively, now there is another storytelling tradition. In the old days, the great books of the church, for instance, and the oral traditions of many people were not so free. A person had to recite the Quran or whatever in exact the right way. He couldn't let one syllable out. He didn't have the freedom that you have to do this interpretation and interaction with the audience.
Well, there I think often what was taking place is that the story was a way of passing a theology down to a group of people, and the concern was that the theology be completely correct without any individual variation or interpretation. I'm not concerned in giving a theological teaching from any tradition when I tell a story. I'm really trying to convey what are essential elements in the human spiritual journey.
Okay, but this means that you allow the individual to have his own experience.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I would definitely say that. And I think that's what I often say to people is, I tell the story, but you also have something to do. Which, what I ask you to do is to be very present in your own heart and to note as you listen to the story what happens to your heart, and especially what arises in your heart and what parts of the story touch you the deepest. Because that's really where it's your story. It's where you recognize something of your own archetypal journey. And that's what I think has the value in
now,
the story.
you have a certain way to doing that. Yeah, have a drink. But
Thank
you
you.
have certain... when you lead a group, you make people aware of their energy centers and of the way they do it. Can you give a little example of how you do that?
Well, I find it very helpful. I have traveled in a number of countries and lead pilgrimages, and recently I was in a country called Uzbekistan. And one of the things I like in certain countries is how they greet people. And in Uzbekistan, the way the greeting often takes place is a person places their hand on their heart and they look you directly in the eyes. And there's a meeting.
So it is like you connect to your heart and then to the other person.
You got it exactly. And there's a meeting. And to me, that's the most essential piece. So why I ask the audience to do that, or the group of people gathered, is first to meet themselves before they listen to the story, to find a connection to their own heart, a place of openness, and a place of looking, or often I'll start by having people greet all the people around them, so that we start with that place of meeting, that place of connectedness, because I find one of the great wounds in contemporary society is an incredible sense of isolation and loneliness and disconnectedness. So it's a way of starting, and it's a simple way. You take your hand and you, in English we have the expression, if you're touched by something, it takes you into the depth of your own being. So it's a way of taking that sense of touching your feeling center, your heart center, and starting from there.
Good. But we are skimming on one of the... Let's not make this a superficial discussion. One of the main things in the history of any religion or church is the dogmatism versus the experiential.
Surely.
The experience that a person has himself, and most founders of churches, Christ, and must have had these holy experiences, this unitive experience. But then there is the dogma. Now you were just saying that what people are lacking is the feeling of connectedness. Now,
Yes.
we have to agree that some churches offer, by their dogmatic attitude, a social structure that makes you feel at home. But this goes against the grain of your own individual interpretation of that dogmatic truth that they feed you. How do you see that? Is there a balance there, or is there...
It's a very good question, and I think it's a question that's at the heart of our kind of culture, because it's a question of belonging and truth. And if belonging into a community comes at the price of what's really true to me, then I think it's at the cost of one's soul. But because there's so much pain in our culture through the loss of belonging, the loss of church community, the loss of extended family, the loss of living in a place where you've belonged. So there's an incredible hunger for belonging. But often the price that comes is you can belong as long as you comply to a certain truth that's placed out. And then a person is put into a tremendous bind. Do I give up the belonging in order to stand by my own truth? And often that's a step of individuation. That's a step where somebody has to acknowledge what is truly real for them. And in my own life, probably the most pivotal moment in my own spiritual journey is I was raised in the Roman Catholic tradition, which has a lot of richness that I received from it, especially the mystical aspects of the Mass. But one of the things that happened for me when I was about 12 or 13 is the bind I was placed in. And the bind was, in those days, the church had a teaching that if someone was divorced and remarried and died in that situation, they would probably go to hell. So I had a mother who was in that situation, who I knew as a deeply loving person. So I was placed in the bind of having been raised in a church that said God is primarily love, but that same God that was primarily love was also going to place my mother in hell because she had divorced and remarried. It didn't go together.
Okay, so there was a struggle between the dogmatic stance of the church, or the ethical stance, and your own experience.
And my own experience, and also what the church had told me, that at the center of Christianity is a God of love. So I was in a situation of seeing how can a God of love place a good, loving person, who was certainly tremendously loving to me, into hell because the rules are more important than the love. And at that moment in my life, I chose a God of love as the primary God for me. Other people make other choices. But do you understand
that some people do make the choice for the rules, for
the
security that it offers?
Surely, I do understand it. I would also say that I think it's very difficult to live in today's world for many people because there is so much change so quickly. And how does one make one's way through the world? Especially in terms of raising children, how do you make certain decisions? Where's the security of a structure and a tradition that has told you what is certain, what is right, and what's wrong?
Okay, so what happens is a lot of people go for the what we now call politically correct, which might include a religion, might include the belief in the internet, computers, progress, even the green thinking, but they're not willing to look for themselves.
Well, I think that's the key piece in our time is, to me, that's the huge change that's taking place, is people have to take responsibility, and it's part of what I would define as mature spirituality. It's what it means to be an adult spiritually, is to take responsibility for your own journey, whether it's in a church, whether it's in a synagogue, whether it's in a tradition.
But that's true. But isn't that unloving? Because that I see a lot in the New Age world, or when we go to seminars, that the people say, yes, there is an enlightened way. There is a way where you become one with your own experience, where you become unitive or whatever. And those, suckers, but those other people out there, they don't get it. They get glued to their belief systems and their cars and their telephones. Yeah, this is what I feel in my own life. If there's a God of love, if it's all about no separation, because I think that's for my life, no separation. I am only different as I have not yet learned to be the same. Yeah. How can I even talk with people who say they're enlightened? Not that you say that, but
I certainly don't say that.
But this idea that there is two classes of people: those who know and who are in the knowing or in the enlightenment, and those who are not.
I think that is the great temptation in spirituality, particularly in our time, which is the temptation of specialness.
Yes.
That somehow I'm special because I'm in this tradition, I'm special because I have this teacher, I'm special because I'm part of an elite group, I'm special because I do spiritual practices. That specialness is a kind of narcissism that I think is against the very root of what traditions are really about. I mean, it's supposed to be based upon a compassion, a love, which is not judging the other person as being less than myself, and I'm in a special situation.
Okay. So that's something to watch out for.
I think it's incredibly something to watch out for.
Was this Rumi or Kabir? I think it was Kabir who told this story about how he tried to be loving, and then he said, yeah, and then I took all my clothes away, I threw my clothes away, and then I found myself walking around naked, very prideful. Yes.
Surely.
He went from stage to stage and always found himself to be different from the rest. So that even in his extreme nakedness, he kind of posed as being more naked. And that I feel in the world is a true problem. We always tend to be, as you say, more special.
Well, I think spiritual pride stinks worse than other kinds of pride, to be very honest about it. And it's a difficult thing because there is that sense of people can easily get into it. There's a sense of just being special and they don't know. There was one time I gave an exercise actually with a group in Holland. And one of the things I just suggested is that they go out during the lunch break. It was a beautiful day. And just try to be present with the beauty of the world around them. And one person came back and she was laughing to the point where it was difficult for her to talk, and she said, there I was walking down the street thinking to myself, well, aren't I special because I'm doing this exercise in presence that Atum suggested. And she said she came to the end of the street and there was a huge man lying in a boat, beet red because he was tremendously overburnt with the sun, and he just looked at her and started to laugh. And she realized, what am I doing thinking that I'm somehow special? Because the great difficulty of specialness is it separates you out.
Yes. You no longer belong.
You out. Yes.
It's no longer your brother there. That's why people are complaining about beggars in these days. In Amsterdam we have them every major city in the world now. But the Eastern way of meeting a beggar is to thank him for reminding you who you are. It's like his gift to you that he reminds you.
Well, I find in America, in a course that I taught in a graduate school there for psychotherapists, is every person at some point admitted that they had a fear of becoming a homeless person, becoming a beggar on the street. And many of these people in the class were quite wealthy with good careers. It's not something that was a rational fear.
Wasn't it Gurdjieff who said that part of his training was to be a beggar for a while? He would send you out in the streets to become a beggar. And isn't part of the Theravada Buddhist tradition that you actually become a beggar in the sense that if you become a priest, you have to go out in the streets and not touch money?
Well, and there is also something that, Buddha had a beggar's bowl and St. Francis had a beggar's bowl. There's something about it as a spiritual practice, I think, whether one is a homeless person or not, which is the recognition that we live each moment based upon what the world gives us. Really, whatever condition we're living in, whether we're wealthy or not wealthy, the reality is that in the next moment we live from what the world provides. We all have a beggar's bowl. Some people are more aware of it than others. But it's from what the world provides.
Yeah, it's interesting. You were touching St. Francis. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Sufi tradition. Now, for me, the Sufi tradition is about being about God or with God or seeking God in the world. St. Francis had that same kind of attitude. He was a young kid, rich, and then one day decided he wanted to live God's life. Yeah? The only thing I really remember is him talking to the birds, What a Buddhist would say, yes, but those are sentient beings, but the church probably says they have no souls, but he talked to the birds. I like that. That decision in your life, that your life is now God's, or that your devotion is for the beloved, is that important? Is that...
In Sufism?
Yeah.
In Sufism it's central, and I would say that there are certain treasures that I've received from Sufism. And one of the primary treasures is the image of God as beloved or friend. Because what it does is it gives you a God that you can fully open to and fully trust, and in that bond of love be transformed. So I think that that's a key aspect is, how do I learn to live with the beloved? That's one of the very central practices in Sufism. How do I learn to live with the beloved that lives inside of me? How do I learn to live with the beloved that lives inside of you? How do I learn to live with the beloved that's in the moment? How do I learn to somehow remember the beloved in the person that I don't get along with? So the practice becomes that the beloved is always there.
Okay, I give you my poem for that.
Okay, great.
Who am I but my friends in me? Who are they but the friend in me? Then what about my enemy? Who is he, who is she in me?
That's really beautiful.
That's Sufism, isn't it?
That's Sufism right there,
Yes.
in the very core of it.
Yes, I know.
And it's the place of moving out of that kind of separation that puts us in judgment of other people continually, and self-judgment or grandiosity. And to discover that there is something that lies at the core of all of this, which Sufism calls the beloved.
Yeah. Now, there are religions, like the Judeo-Christian tradition, where we see God more as a father, as a paternalistic, something outside, far away, and probably above us. You talk about the beloved, the friend. We can also talk about the God in us, and the most extreme forms of mystical belief have come to that point where people said, "I am God," and they sometimes ended up on the stakes being burned for that. Yeah. God outside, God inside, God in everything, immanence, transcendence. Where does Sufi differ from this more traditional view of God as a father?
Well, first of all, I would say that from my perspective, in Christianity and in mystical Judaism, in both of the mystical immanent aspect of God. So there's a German mystic who had a very beautiful phrase hundreds of years ago and said, what good does it do if Christ was born 2,000 years ago and isn't born in you today? You know, where
was
is
that,
the...
Jacob Boehm?
Yeah, no, it was...
Meister Eckhart? No.
The moment it's Angelicus Salinus or something like that. Please excuse my German because it's not a language I know.
Okay.
But I think that's the piece, is that if the resurrected Christ is in the world today, it's in the world in people who carry that spirit, who carry that presence.
But isn't that it in everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
And I think that's what someone like Mother Teresa reminded us of, as she so vividly said, what enabled her to do that work is the person in need directly before her was the living, crucified Christ at that moment. Not an historical figure of 2,000 years ago, but the embodiment of the crucified Christ, the living Christ at that moment, was right before her.
So her way to the unity was to acknowledge and the Christ now.
Yes.
Yeah?
I think very much so. She saw, as far as I understand, she saw the living Christ present in the world in the suffering that took place in humanity, the suffering aspect of Christ, and I would imagine the resurrected aspect of Christ in those people who she worked with who had moments of incredible breakthrough.
Mm. But you know, at the same time we had a guy here, Yuji Krishnamurti, a while ago, and he said, yeah, but do you know that for every child that Mother Teresa saved, parents in other regions of India would send their kids to Calcutta or Bombay, and so by doing what she did, many more children suffered more. Also in India, people say, why worry about someone else's karma? If that child is there to die, it's her karma, let it happen.
Well,
yeah, that's hard. I mean, this is the individual choice we have when we come home and there is a drug addict on your doorstep. Yes,
that's right.
What do we do? I mean, you can talk about Christianity and love, but that's what happens. You come home at night and there's someone lying there. What do? You give him 25 gills so you can buy some more dope and move over, or you say, friend.
Well, that's the piece that I think we're confronted with.
Yeah.
Consistently, and it's probably why the beggars are in all of the major cities where we're so wealthy, is we have to be confronted with the other side of life. And I think the question of whether we give them money or not, do they use it for drugs and alcohol, is a very key question. But the deeper question is, how do I treat them? Do I acknowledge their humanity, or do I become ignoring of them and brush them off because they remind me of something that I don't want to see?
Yeah, but so the first thing is, how do we see them?
To me, that's the key.
That's the key.
How do I
we
see
them?
that person who's before me? And do I really see them as a human being? I remember one of the things that Martin Luther King taught people who were in the civil rights movement is if you had the police coming at you with clubs or whatever, the most important thing was to make eye contact. Because it was much more difficult for a person to turn you into an object when they made eye contact. And that's the piece. I mean, that's also what confronted St. Francis. We're like St. Francis.
Actually, there was a police chief here in Amsterdam. We had all these riots. And he said, the police moves in plain clothes, not in uniform, but not this, this weapon. You move with the demonstrators. You become part of the demonstration. You talk with them. You're with them, and then nothing will happen. Of course, they will demonstrate, and you might even believe that their cause is rightful because you were,
Should they?
But that's a far more effective way dealing with them than putting on all this strange stuff and yeah.
I completely agree. I think that's because immediately then it polarizes the situation, and both sides are seen as the enemy.
Yes.
And if you're looking at somebody who's completely covered in all kinds of garb and all kinds of
he is
stuff.
a non-person. He becomes a machine. Yeah.
And I think that becomes the difficulty. On the other side is that the police then also become non-persons. On both sides, they're kind of robbed at some point of their humanity. And we're all people.
Okay, bringing that back to the history of, say, Sufism, and Sufism as the mystical experience in life, as the experiential versus the dogmatic. And we've seen that in history in the Qatars, which we called ketters, the word we have for the other self. All these groups of people, through history, have been regarded as a danger to society. Mm-hmm. So have been the Sufis. Now they're kind of accepted, but there's still countries where the Sufis are regarded as the dangerous arm of the Islam. Yeah.
Surely.
How do you accept that? I mean, to be coming from a good point, trying to love God and the other person, being pushed into a revolutionary group and being burned and prosecuted and stuff like that. How can you handle that?
Well, that historically has been the situation of a number of Sufis, like Al-Hallaj and Attar, and a number of people have been prosecuted and even martyred because of their mystical experience, particularly a figure like Al-Hallaj who spoke publicly.
That is what I mean. What you can do with that is either you keep quiet and hide, or you stand up and, like the Qatars did, and say, we are the perfect, or we want to be perfect. Yeah?
Well,
strange.
And I think that brings the very key question, which is the concern of traditional religion and then the situation in mysticism. If someone says, I am God, if they actually are saying that with their ego, not only is it blasphemous from a traditional viewpoint, but it's also the height of inflation. If it is being said not by them personally, but the greater reality is speaking through them, then it is the depth of mystical experience. But then the question is, who judges that from the outside? And that's where the problems have occurred.
Yeah, but do we have to take the church, what came over the Inquisition against the Qatars? And the interesting person in the history is Dominic Guzman, who started the Dominicans. He said the only way to fight the Qatars, which were the perfect people, they were dressed in black and they were very holy people, is to be more holy than them. That's how he started his movement. Mm-hmm. Then the Pope used his brothers and the whole Dominican order to fight them in another way, because they became part of the Inquisition. Do we really have to condemn those who go after the minority group, who go after the mysticism? Because their concern is for the whole of the church, or the whole of the faithful.
Well, Abraham Maslow wrote a brilliant book that is very small, called Religion, Values, and Peak Experiences. Yeah. And one of the things that he says, which is at the center of the book that I found very valuable, is all of the great religious traditions have arisen out of a deep mystical experience by the founder.
Mm-hmm.
And then that mystical experience, the founder attempt to convey to other people. And out of that, they were so deeply changed, they sought to convey it to other people. But at some point, as that attempt to pass it on grew, there then became a movement from a mystical experience passed on to an organization, an organized body. And at a certain point, what happens is that the people in charge of the organized body don't necessarily have the mystical experience of the founder, and in fact view other people who participate in that mystical experience of the founder as a threat. You
Yeah,
with me?
I know, but what I'm trying to see is
Okay.
that, say, the church, in the history, but even now, seeing its wider responsibility for those people who don't have the mystical experience or don't have connected to the mystical experience, has to say, yes, you have to behave like this, again, where we started, because it gives a social structure that you need. Again, if I gave you the assignment to find a easy psychotherapeutical way that can be administered by relatively untrained people to the largest amount of people, yes,
Yes.
you might come up with the same solution as the church did with the sacraments, yes? Confession, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Which was a fairly simple administered psychotherapeutic tool.
Yes, I think it had
and
great
it
value.
worked, and it had
Yes.
great value, yes? So what a brilliant idea.
And it's sacramental.
Yes, and at the same time, it's not a mystical experience. It has nothing to do with your own experience. It is kind of mechanized religion, yeah?
Well, but here I would differ with you. I really do think that people can have mystical experiences within the sacraments. I think that that's the potentiality within
That
the
is
Mass.
true.
That's the potentiality within the sacraments. Many people are not taught how that's a possibility. But I think that's what the essence of sacramental life is, that it opens the doorway to the divine, the experience of the divine, and to me that's the essence of mysticism. So I think that potential is there.
Okay, if we don't say to the divine, could you
Okay.
say it opens the doorway to our deeper layers?
Yes, and for
Yes,
me I would
for-
say, I mean, that's one of the ways I would describe the divine, is in the very depth of us lies that experience of the divine. That's why in Sufism, or at least in the Sufi teacher who's been most significant to me, Hazrat Inayat Khan, he speaks of, from his experience, the most holy place is each human being's heart. It's holier than any temple, any church, any mosque, because that's where the living God is present in the depth of each human being's heart. And he spoke about his hope in the future, what we would eventually have. He called the religion of the heart, which would be the reality of that practice. So to me, that's central. That's the most important piece, is that in each human being I potentially...
That is so intangible. That is, yes, it's the heart and it's love, but define that, in practical life, there is the problem of living that. And
Yeah.
I sometimes feel,
You got it.
what is
That's
the
it.
difference between, we're obsessed with information and knowledge and all that kind of stuff. Wisdom is what matters, yes? Now the internet doesn't give wisdom, because what's the difference between knowledge and wisdom is wisdom is knowledge with love. Someone said that sometime, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
It's that little added connectedness
Yes.
which makes all the difference. So if we can get the knowledge that we have so abundantly in books and internet, and yes, connected. And that's where I feel we are kind of failing in this time and age.
Well, traditionally, wisdom was a feminine quality, and the reason why it was feminine is because it came through the heart. It's not only knowledge that's conceptualized within the mind, it is knowledge that has passed through the heart. It has passed through a living experience. It has passed through a human context. That's what makes wisdom different than conceptual knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And in Sufism, that became extremely important because the divine intelligence was something that was accessible based upon the heart being in a certain condition. So to me, the heart becomes, I mean, that's one of the things I've appreciated from Sufism, from Rumi, etc. The heart becomes the central way of experiencing that connectedness. And that's why the whole exploration of the heart as a kind of inner universe is one of the central pieces. And then how do we learn to meet in the heart is another whole piece. I think our culture would be entirely different if we knew how to meet in the heart.
And obviously in Uzbekistan, they remember that.
They do, and when you go there, for the people who still practice that, it feels like your heart is washed because somebody actually looks at you. Years ago, I met a woman in America who's quite well known in certain circles named Helen Luke. And she wrote for a magazine called Parabola, which is a Jungian magazine, and was a kind of Christian contemplative also. And I met Helen, and one of the questions I wanted to ask her was the definition of spiritual guidance, because she was considered an expert. And it was an amazing meeting, and at the end of the meeting...
Loose?
Helen Luke, L-U-K-E.
I think I interviewed her. She was living in... Okay, sometime.
Okay. And so at the end I said to her, well, since you're someone I really respect in spiritual guidance from your writing, what is the essence of spiritual guidance? And she stopped for a moment and she looked at me and she said, meeting, just as we have now. It's a way of meeting that I think is the most important piece. That's the piece I think we have to learn.
Yeah, sharing and being.
Yeah, and the very word you wrote down, connectedness. How do we move from a place of isolation, a place of separateness, a place of judgment, a place of inadequacy, a place of self-consciousness? How do we move through that and meet the other?
Okay.
That to me is the key. However you want to name that, that to me is the most important piece at this moment in our culture.
Okay. Let me finish this then by saying that in this city, we have angels of connectedness. They're called beggars by some.
Yes, okay.
But that's what they are.
Yes. And often not always, because I also want to honor that often people who live on the street some people, at least in America, are actually quite psychologically disturbed, because what we've done in America is we've taken a lot of people, which we initially thought was a good idea, out of institutions and put them on the street. So a lot of people are really suffering from very severe psychological illness in the streets of America. And it's difficult to relate to them. It's not simply the contact with a poor person. There's someone who's psychologically in a very difficult place, and often an individual doesn't know how to relate to that. And that becomes another whole place of difficulty.
Well, we've work to do that.
Okay, we sure do. A lifetime.
We spoke with Atum Kane. You can find his email there, as a telephone number. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, it's my joy.
Talking about Sufism, and again, if people want to know more about Sufism, go buy books, go see on the internet. What we try to do is to place it in a wider context of today, living, love, and the beloved.
I deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I enjoyed that immensely.
Yeah, I did too.